Gresham College presents Thatcherism, 1979 to 1990, by Professor Vernon Bogdanor.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a lecture in the series on British history in the 20th century, and the last lecture, for those who came to it, was on pre-Thatcherism, and the next one, which will be the last, will be on post-Thatcherism, so it's natural this one should be on Thatcherism. And Margaret Thatcher was elected leader of the Conservative Party in February 1975, much to the surprise of many leading Conservatives. Reginald Maudling, who'd been Chancellor and Home Secretary in previous Conservative governments, said that the party had taken leave of its senses. Lord Carrington, who was to be Foreign Secretary in Margaret Thatcher's government, said that she would be out of the leadership by Christmas. But in fact, she was leader of the Conservative Party for 15 years and Prime Minister for 11 3/4 years, which is the longest continuous time of any Prime Minister since the Napoleonic Wars, Lord Liverpool, 1812 to 1827. You have to go back that far to find someone who was Prime Minister for longer. But even more than that, she gave her name to an ideology, Thatcherite. And she's the only Prime Minister of the 20th century who did that. We do talk, it's true, about someone being Churchillian, but I think by that we mean a style rather than a set of ideas. But Thatcherism, is a set of ideas, and what I will try and do is to describe what these ideas were. Now, Margaret Thatcher was very different from most of her predecessors as leader of the Conservative Party, apart, ironically, from the man she supplanted, Edward Heath, with whom she had, I think, something in common. If you look at the four Prime Ministers of Conservative governments in 1951 to 64, they were Churchill, Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, and Sir Alec Douglas Hume. Churchill was the grandson of a duke. Eden was the son of a baronet. Harold Macmillan was the son-in-law of a duke. And Sir Alec Douglas Hume had been a 14th Earl before he renounced his title. And the last three, all except Churchill, had been to Eton. Churchill did not go to Eton, he went to Harrow. Now, these four leaders were succeeded in the Conservative Party by Edward Heath, who was the son of a builder and a lady's maid. And then after Margaret Thatcher, John Major, who was the son of a trapeze artist, who in retirement sold garden furniture. And those two and Margaret Thatcher did not go to public school. They went to grammar schools, state grammar schools. Now, Margaret Thatcher, as is well known, was born in Grantham. She was a daughter of a grocer. And she was one in her first government. She was one of just three people who hadn't been to public school. But by the end of her government, the public school numbers were going down. There was just one old Etonian left in the cabinet, and she was succeeded by John Major. But perhaps the pendulum swung back again with David Cameron, we don't know. But Margaret Thatcher often stressed her humble origins and said that her upbringing in difficult circumstances had given her many lessons in sound housekeeping, living within a budget in particular, and that was of great value in government. But her background was not quite as humble as she suggested. Her father, in fact, owned 2 grocery stores and employed several people, and he was a local dignitary. He was a councillor, then an alderman, and then mayor of Grantham, and he was also chairman of the governors of the girls' grammar school, which Margaret Thatcher attended. The father had entered local government, interestingly enough, not as a Conservative, but as a Liberal. He was a Methodist, and like most nonconformists, he became a Liberal. And then he became an Independent, which meant, in effect, a Conservative then in local government. And when he spoke for Margaret Thatcher in her first electoral outing in Dartford in 1949, he said that by tradition his family were Liberal, But the Conservative Party stood for very much the same things now as the Liberal Party did in his young days. And Margaret Thatcher later said that if Gladstone was alive, he'd be a paid member of the Conservative Party in modern times. Now, Margaret Thatcher's father was well off enough to pay for her to go to grammar school, because she went to grammar school before the 1944 Education Act, when getting in depended on paying a fee, and she couldn't have gone without the fees being paid. And her father also paid for her to go to Oxford, so she wasn't as poor as she sometimes suggested. But in any case, although she spoke a lot about her roots in Grantham, she left as soon as she could. And she went to Oxford, and after that she came back very rarely, and she married a wealthy businessman, lived in London, and sought a safe constituency in the home counties. She didn't want to represent anywhere in the north of England. And I think the difficulty she faced in the Conservative Party wasn't so much due to her origins, though it was a problem. The Conservatives were then still dominated to some extent by old money and connections, but her gender. Now, in the 1945 general election, amongst Conservative MPs, there was just one female. It was a man's world then, and most of her competitors in selection committees had very good war records and sold themselves to constituencies on that basis. It was extremely important then, indeed, I think difficult to get a Conservative seat for many years after the war unless you had a good war record. But the emphasis on her origins, though exaggerated, was not entirely mythical. It was of some importance, because despite her relatively wealthy lifestyle after her marriage, Margaret Thatcher did not identify with the very rich, but what she called her people. And these people were shopkeepers like her father, the lower middle class and the self-employed, and they formed the backbone of the Conservative Party. Now, a great deal has been written about the working class and the Labour Party, and it's certainly the case that if in the 20th century the working class had voted solidly for Labour, Labour would have been in power all the time, because the majority of people of the 20th century were defined as working class. But in fact, around a third of the working class normally voted Conservative. Under Margaret Thatcher, a much greater percentage. In the 1987 election, a majority of the skilled working class seemed to have voted Conservative. So people exaggerate, perhaps, class consciousness amongst the working class. But the middle classes, Margaret Thatcher's people, are much more class conscious. Of the small shopkeepers and the self-employed, around 90% vote Conservative, much more solidly than members of the professional or managerial classes or the very rich. These are the people whom the Conservative Party represents, and even more than the Labour Party represented the working class. And Margaret Thatcher was often accused of representing middle-class values and of seeking to fight for outdated middle-class values. And when she stood for the Conservative leadership in 1975, she met that accusation head-on. She said, "If middle-class values include the encouragement of variety and individual choice, the provision of fair incentives and rewards for skill and hard work, the maintenance of effective barriers against the excessive power of the state, and a belief in the wide distribution of individual private property, then they are certainly what I am trying to defend." She said they were the values of what she called our people. But she also said that they were the values of many people who wanted to become middle class, that is, the aspiring working class, the C2s in sociological jargon. And these formed the backbone of her electoral support. Some people call them rather slightingly Essex man, Essex woman. And there was, in the 1980s, there was a tremendous swing to the Conservatives, not only in Essex, but then the whole of the northeast pocket going out of London, in Essex, in Bedfordshire, Huntingdonshire, which was John Major's seat, Cambridgeshire and so on. Many of those areas had overspill from East London, and they were aspiring working class people, C2s who wanted to join the middle class and who were attracted by the appeal to middle class values. Now, after leaving office in 1996, she was rather disenchanted with John Major's government, and she gave an interview in 1996, said, "We were now failing," she said, "since we are unpopular, above all because the middle classes and those who aspire to join the middle classes feel they no longer have the incentives and opportunities they expect from a Conservative government." So this was the social grouping she represented. And I said they were the backbone of the Conservative Party. but they tended to be taken for granted and perhaps ignored by conservative leaders in the immediate post-war years. Because the main concern of leaders like Harold Macmillan and Edward Heath was with the organised working class, and in particular the unemployment of the interwar years. They were very scarred for that experience of unemployment in the interwar years, and they said this must not come back again. Do everything possible to ensure it doesn't come back. And the way to do it was to get accommodation with the trade unions, to work out policies with the trade unions to ensure full employment and improve working class living standards. Don't make the mistake, they said, of the Conservatives in the 1920s, of confrontation, the general strike and all that, division of the country into two nations. We want one nation, and that may mean making concessions to the unions in terms of wages and so on to avoid industrial strife. Now, what about those who didn't belong to trade unions? Those on fixed incomes, the self-employed, the small shopkeepers, pensioners. These people who could not protect themselves against inflation and had no organised group to represent them. These people were often the backbone of conservative constituency associations, but the leaders took no notice of them. Now that perhaps didn't matter too much in the 1950s and 60s, period of high economic growth, because when you had affluence there was enough for everyone and living standards of all could improve. But it did matter as inflation started to increase and growth started to fall. And Margaret Thatcher represented the people who were the victims of that economic process. Now, a lot of the analysis of the 1960s in particular and 1970s, perhaps you've been watching the television programs on the 1970s, concentrated on the resentments from the left, the threat from the left to the post-war settlement. The student revolt in the late 1960s, trade union militancy, the right of the left in the Labour Party under Tony Benn, and that threatened, it was thought, the post-war settlement. But the real threat, because it was much more powerful sociologically, was coming from the right, and there was a much greater sense of alienation from the right than from the left. And from that point of view, I think Margaret Thatcher can be seen as a much greater revolutionary figure than Tony Benn. Now, together with that economic revolt that I've just mentioned, there was also what one might call a cultural revolt, a revolt against the permissive society reforms of the 1960s that was most strongly represented by Mary Whitehouse. Now, Margaret Thatcher pretended, I think, to support that. In fact, she was remarkably liberal in her voting behaviour. She voted in favour of abortion law reform in the 1960s and homosexual law reform in the 1960s. Though she voted in favour of the retention of capital punishment, and the only time in her career she ever broke a Tory three-line whip was the vote in favour of retaining birching for young offenders. But on homosexual and abortion law reform, she was not on the side of Mary Whitehouse. The cultural revolt was also against new trends in education, progressive teaching, comprehensive schools, rebels in the universities. Also, I think, a revolt against the view that Britain was no longer a great power, the denigration of patriotism, revolt against Europe, growth of Euroscepticism, hostility to mass immigration. But above all, fear of inflation and fear of trade union power. And you will remember that in February 1974, Edward Heath called an election on the issue of trade union power, in which he asked the question, who governs? And that led to, certainly the answer not you, but it led to a hung parliament in which it wasn't clear who governed, and the rise of nationalism and protest parties. And people argued not perhaps who governed, but can Britain be governed at all? Is Britain governable? And in particular, is Britain governable against the wishes of the trade union leaders? In 1979, the Daily Telegraph had an election cartoon with James Callaghan, the Prime Minister, with a poster saying, vote Labour. Behind him there was a trade unionist, and the cartoon went on, vote Labour dash or else. In other words, could the country be governed against the wishes of the trade union leaders? So it wasn't only economic decline people were worried about, but also political decline. And some people felt in the 70s, particularly at the time of the Winter of Discontent in 78-9, but also in 74, I think, that they were looking into an abyss, that there was something very wrong with the country. And Thatcherism was born out of that. It's a kind of British equivalent, if you like, of Gaullism in France, born out of economic decline and political decline. And having mentioned France, there were similar developments in other countries. Indeed, in Britain, it hadn't been noticed. The vote was given to 18-year-olds in 1969, I beg your pardon. They voted for the first time in 1970. And it was assumed this was a vote for the permissive generation, but people were thinking only of a small minority at universities. Studies of 18 to 21-year-olds showed, for example, that they were much more in favour of capital punishment than their elders. And in 1970, they voted disproportionately for Edward Heath against Wilson. And in America, when the vote was lowered, they voted disproportionately for Richard Nixon in 1972. Now, Richard Nixon spoke of a silent majority, and that was a similar phenomenon in Britain. So it's a manifestation of a new social mood, which was very different from that of traditional conservatives, because traditional conservatives wanted to preserve. But the kind of mood we're talking about wanted to change, if you like, put the clock back, but alter things, that society had gone too far, if you like, down the road to perdition. They wanted less inflation, less power for the trade unions, less immigration, less kowtowing to other countries, back to basics in education and morality. And a conservatism which had become an elite philosophy, if you like, was now becoming a popular philosophy whose aim was not to defend the status quo, but to subvert it, a radical form of conservatism. And Margaret Thatcher was very much in tune with that, and much more in tune with her conservative predecessors. Nigel Lawson, who was Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor from 1983 to 1989, said, "Harold Macmillan had a contempt for the party. Alec Hume tolerated it. Ted Heath loathed it. Margaret genuinely liked it. She felt a communion with it." Harold Macmillan himself agreed with that estimate. He said, musing in the mid-1980s, he said, "We used to sit listening to these extraordinary speeches at Conservative conferences, urging us to birch or hang them all, or other such strange things. We used to sit quietly, nodding our heads, and when we came to make our speeches, we did not refer to what had been said at all. But watching her, I think she agrees with them." Now, this mood I'm talking about may not have come to the surface if elite conservatism, or One Nation Conservatism, whatever you call it, or even the moderate social democracy of Wilson and Callaghan, if all that had worked, we wouldn't have heard so much of this mood, and it wasn't therefore heard much of in the 50s and 60s, but they weren't very successful. And as I've tried to show in previous lectures, around about 1960, politicians got worried about the low rate of growth of the British economy compared with other countries, and so they must do something about it. But they weren't very successful. What they were going to do about it was a much greater degree of government planning, more state control, government intervention in the economy, government intervention in pay bargaining through incomes policies, sometimes called corporatism. And this went further and further, and under Edward Heath, really a last desperate attempt, if you like, to preserve the post-war settlement through an incomes policy, pushed to its limits. Perhaps it might have succeeded if it wasn't for bad luck. Again, if you watch the programmes on the 1970s, you'll have remembered seeing about the Arab-Israeli War of 1973 and the fourfold increase in oil prices to which it led, which put huge strains on every economy in the West. A combination of high inflation and high unemployment. And it really ruined the attempt to secure this corporate planning, because there simply wasn't enough money to pay off the trade unions to keep them happy. So you came up against a brick wall. And the power of the unions, meantime, seemed to have grown too great, particularly under the governments which succeeded Heath's, the Labour governments of Wilson and Callaghan. And one of Margaret Thatcher's closest allies, Sir Keith Joseph, said in a paper he wrote for the Shadow Cabinet in May 1976, he said the negotiation of an incomes policy gives the trade unions political power, extra power. It leads to bargaining on a far wider basis than incomes policy or economic policy generally. It becomes political, and the resulting package invades the sphere of many other interests and of Parliament. And he called the so-called social contract of the Labour government with the unions a devil's bargain, because it gave the unions tremendous power over all sorts of political decisions. And it led, the Conservatives believed, to a kind of blockage, a kind of iron cage where you couldn't do anything against the wishes of the unions. Now, in 1974, Heath lost the Who Governed election in February, and then he lost the second election in October 1974. The Conservative approach appeared to have hit the buffers. What should be done? Now, the answer of Heath and the Conservative leadership was that they noted the large Liberal vote in these two elections, 6 million votes in February and 5 million votes in October 1974. They said, we have to win over the centre vote. Don't rock the boat. Try and win the centre. No need for a fundamental rethink, but make the Conservatives more attractive to the centrist vote. Now, as you'll have predicted, this was exactly the wrong approach, Margaret Thatcher thought. She thought Conservatives must speak loudly and clearly for genuine Conservative policies, and in particular to meet the danger of decline. Now, the alternative argument was first presented by Margaret Thatcher's ally Sir Keith Joseph in a series of speeches in 1974 against Edward Heath. And his argument was quite different from Heath's. He said that the problem wasn't just Labour governments, but that Conservative governments were equally guilty of serious policy errors. And indeed, the whole post-war settlement had run into the sand. The framework was collapsing. And it was a mistake to think it was just the fault of the Labour Party. It was the Conservative Party as well. They themselves had failed. And Margaret Thatcher adopted that approach. And in 1975, in an article she wrote for the Daily Telegraph when standing for the leadership, she said, "People believe too many Conservatives have become socialists already. Britain's progress towards socialism has been an alternation of 2 steps forward with half a step back. If every Labour government is prepared to reverse every Tory measure, while Conservative governments accept nearly all socialist measures as being the will of the people, the end result is only too plain. And why should anyone support a party that seems to have the courage of no convictions?" Now, in a speech he made in September 1974 at Upminster, Sir Keith Joseph said this: "This is no time to be mealy-mouthed. Since the end of the Second World War, we have had altogether too much socialism. There is no point in my trying to evade what everybody knows. For half of the 30 years, Conservative governments, for understandable reasons, did not consider it practicable to reverse the vast bulk of the accumulating detritus of socialism which on each occasion they found when they returned to office. So we tried to build on its uncertain foundations instead." And characteristically, because he was a great one for self-laceration, he ended by saying, "I must take my share of the blame for following too many of the fashions." Then, in another speech he made at Preston shortly afterwards, he said that inflation is beginning to destroy our society and that we weren't dealing with it because of the bogus fear of mass unemployment. And he said our post-war boom began under the shadow of the 1930s. We were haunted by the fear of long-term mass unemployment, the grim, hopeless dole queues and towns which died. We talked ourselves into believing that these gaunt, tight-lipped men in caps and mufflers were round the corner, and tailored our policy to match these imaginary conditions, for imaginary what they were. And then in a third speech at Luton at the beginning of October 1974, very shortly before the second election of that year, he linked the economic critique with a social critique. He said the post-war consensus had not only impoverished Britain, but it was also destroying the moral foundations of society. He said it was not so long ago we thought we had utopia within reach. What has happened to all this optimism? Has it really crumbled under the weight of rising crime, social decay, and the decline of traditional values? Have we really become a nation of hooligans and vandals, bullies and child batterers, criminals and inadequates? Our loud talk about the community overlies the fact that we have no community. We talk about neighbourhoods, and all too often we have no neighbours. We go on about the home when we only had dwelling places containing television sets. He did actually ask an entrepreneur when visiting a factory later in the 1980s, a sector for industry, whether the director thought that television had really come to stay. He went on, "It is the absence of a frame of rules and community, place and belonging, responsibility and neighbourliness that makes it possible for people to be more lonely than in any previous stage in our history. Vast factories, huge schools, sprawling estates, skyscraping apartment blocks, all these work against our community and our common involvement one with another." Now, this is highly significant and I think made Margaret Thatcher possible because for the first time a senior Conservative minister said that both parties were responsible for Britain's decline relative to her neighbours. Both parties were responsible for the interventionist policies which had led to the crisis. It was a fundamental attack on the post-war settlement, which seemed until perhaps shortly before to have brought full employment and rising standards of welfare. Interestingly enough, a few years later in 1981, Keith Joseph met Tony Benn on a train, and they both agreed the past 35 years had been a disaster. They didn't take the view, it'd been a great improvement, it'd been a disaster, for different reasons, of course, but they agreed with that, and they both want to break the consensus. Not a golden age, as many would think, but a disaster. The left said it was a disaster because the post-war economy was too capitalist, and the right said it was a disaster because it was too socialist. But for the moment, it was the right that was in charge. And Joseph was saying a different approach was needed, relying on the market. Now, they were given support because some of the Joseph recipe was adopted by the Callaghan Labour government. And in the autumn of 1976, shortly before Britain had to call on the IMF to deal with the budget deficit, James Callaghan, the Prime Minister, made a very important speech at the Labour Party conference, said to have been written by his son-in-law, Peter Jay, but it was a very important speech. He said this, which Joseph would have agreed with. He said, "We used to think that you could spend your way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you in all candour that that option no longer exists, and that insofar as it ever did exist, it only worked on each occasion since the war by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy, followed by a higher level of unemployment as the next step. Higher inflation, followed by higher unemployment. That is the history of the last 20 years." Now, Joseph and Margaret Thatcher said what was needed was a new settlement, one based on the state's withdrawing from the management of the economy. And the main task of the state was simply to provide the framework through achieving sound money, ending inflation, an environment in which businessmen can prosper. And that the Aladdin's lamp, as it were, was held not by government but by entrepreneurs. And Joseph said, the character who works the magic is the entrepreneur. He's the Aladdin who creates the jobs. Now, what Keith Joseph did, and I think it's fundamental to Margaret Thatcher's period of office, he gave the Conservatives something they hadn't really had since the beginning of the century, a degree of intellectual self-confidence. For the first time, there was, if you like, a counter-ideology to socialism, social democracy, a conviction that the left could be defeated on the battleground of ideas. And Margaret Thatcher said this. She dedicated the autobiographical volume of her memoirs to Keith Joseph and said, "He gave us back our intellectual self-confidence. It was Keith," she said, "who really began to turn the intellectual tide back against socialism. If Keith hadn't been doing all that work with the intellectuals, all the rest of our work would probably never have resulted in success." Now, when she stood against Edward Heath for leadership in 1975, she told her constituents in Finchley, "I'm trying to represent the deep feelings of the many thousands of rank-and-file Tories in the country, and potential Conservative voters too, who feel let down by our party and find themselves unrepresented in a political vacuum." She said, "If the party stood up for true Conservative values, we shall not have to convert people to our principles. They will simply rally to those that are truly their own." And when she stood for election, she said, I met a lot of prejudice, and she says in her memoirs, in the eyes of the wet Tory establishment, I was not only a woman, but that woman. Someone not just of a different sex, but of a different class. A person with an alarming conviction that the values and virtues of Middle England should be brought to bear on the problems which the establishment consensus has created. And she was known in Conservative Central Office for some time after her election as that bloody woman. The initials were TBW. And when Margaret Thatcher got papers with TBW on it, she at first thought it was the title of a TV station and didn't realise it referred actually to her. Now, she came to power in 1979 after the Winter of Discontent, after the decade of public sector strikes, which in the 1970s, again, if you've been watching the television programmes, you'll see what I mean, seemed to be a decade of confusion, decline and economic failure, taking the country to the brink of collapse. But Margaret Thatcher's victory closes one chapter of post-war British history, which had included the Acne government's social reforms, the independence of the colonies, One Nation Conservatism, our entry into Europe. It ends that with the national leadership passing to a new post-war generation with new ideas and values. And to everyone's surprise, 1979 heralded a period of 10 or more years of political stability after the instability of the 70s. Now, what was Thatcherism? Now, perhaps the best way to answer that question is to go to the source herself, Margaret Thatcher. She was asked by Robin Day in 1987 what it was. She said this: sound finance and government running the affairs of the nation in a sound financial way. It stands for honest money, not inflation. It stands for living within our means. It stands for incentives. It stands for the wider and wider spread of ownership of property, of houses, of shares, of savings. It stands for being strong in defence, a reliable ally and a trusted friend. And I think one can divide the long period of Margaret Thatcher in office into 4 different phases. Now, in the first phase, from 1979 roughly to 1983, she succeeded in clearing away 2 main obstacles to the achievement of her aims. The first was high inflation, and the second was the power of the trade unions. Now, she abandoned the idea of incomes policies which every government since Harold Macmillan's in the 1960s had put forward. And she said the government cannot help secure a level of employment. That depends on decisions made by employers and by trade unionists. All the government can do is to produce sound money through control of money supply. The great mistake of post-war demand management was to react to rising unemployment by injecting more money into the system, which, as Callaghan had said, after all, just caused inflation. If you want to get high employment, you must become more efficient, encourage competition, remove government controls, and make individuals more responsible for their choices. So the level of unemployment depends upon the free decisions of individuals in the industrial system, employers, but particularly trade unions. It does not depend on government. Now, the consequence of all that was a very rapid rise in unemployment, which reached 3 million in 1983 and did not drop much until 1986. Now, previously it had been thought governments couldn't win elections with that high level of unemployment. And indeed there were riots on the streets in 1981 in many inner city areas. But people forgot that most of the unemployed at that time, at any rate, lived in areas of safe labour seats. And in any case, the unemployed often did not vote. And that had also been true in the interwar years when mass unemployment was not incompatible with very large conservative majorities. But to some extent, the result of that was the growth of 2 nations, where the areas where unemployment was high, in the old industrial areas, the north, Scotland, Wales, South Wales, and then the south of England, which was comparatively prosperous. And this gave rise to the slogan, if you like, Essex Man. So from this point of view, Thatcherism was as much a symptom of changes as it was a cause. Now, voters continually said throughout the 1980s in opinion polls that they thought unemployment was a more serious problem than inflation. But when they were asked what threatens you and your family most, they said rising prices. So that was what really influenced them in voting. So that was the first thing. Then, with the trade unions, there were a series of acts limiting secondary picketing, requiring ballots before strikes, and also requiring unions to contract in if they wished to pay to political parties. Now, more important than that, perhaps, there was an end to the process of consultation and negotiation with trade unions, which had been Ernest Bevin's key theme from the time he became Minister of Labour and National Service in 1940. So, two pillars of the post-war settlement were crumbling. The first was the commitment to full employment. And the second was the commitment to negotiations and consultations with the trade unions, which had given rise to the trade union veto. And it could be argued had brought down three governments, the previous three governments, the Callaghan government in the winter of discontent, the Heath government in the Who Governs election, and the Wilson government in 1970 after it had failed to secure trade union reform. And John Smith, the Labour Shadow Chancellor in the mid-1980s, told one of Mrs Thatcher's colleagues that the Labour Party owed a big debt to Margaret Thatcher for having tamed the unions. And this colleague then went to see Margaret Thatcher and said that she had shifted the centre of politics about 200 miles to the right. And Margaret Thatcher said, yes, but not far enough. That there were more dragons to slay. And in the second phase of her premiership, she faced two challenges, either of which could have destroyed her premiership. The first being the Falklands, and the second the miners' strike under Arthur Scargill from 1984 to 5. Now, there's a great paradox about the Falklands, that her great success, which first, I think, established her reputation as a leader of determination and strength, it came out of failure. Now, the Argentine, as is well known, laid claim to the Falkland Islands, which were 8,000 miles from Britain, only 400 from Argentine. And the Falklands depended on the Argentine for supplies and food and all the rest of it. So British governments, for some years, had been trying to find a compromise solution which could resolve the difficulties. Now, in the late 1970s, there was some talk of an Argentinian invasion at the time of the Callaghan government when David Owen was Foreign Secretary. And the Labour government then reinforced the Falklands by sending a nuclear-powered ship, HMS Endurance, to the Falklands, and there was no invasion. Now, it's not clear whether the Argentine knew about the dispatch of this ship, so it's not clear whether it was deterred or not. But if they did, it was a triumph for the government, but of course it couldn't say so, and so got no credit for it. Now, Margaret Thatcher was cutting public expenditure and therefore decided to cut naval expenditure, and one of the ways in which it can be cut was to withdraw HMS Endurance from the Falklands, which the Argentinians mistakenly took as a signal that Britain wouldn't defend them. At the same time, the British Nationality Act deprived the Argentinians of their citizenship of Britain and gave them just right of abode. And that, again, mistakenly was interpreted by the Argentinians as Britain didn't care about the Falklands. And the Frank's review of the Falklands after the British victory there said it was inadvisable for the government to announce a decision to withdraw HMS Endurance, and in the light of the developing situation in the second half of 1981, they should have rescinded their decision. That was a misjudgment. Now, the Thatcher government inherited this hot potato, and they decided after a while the best solution was a lease-back solution that they handed over to the Argentine, who would then lease it back to Britain for a long period of years, so that in practice the British people there could remain. There'd be no real alteration, and it would satisfy the Argentinian view that this would be okay. and a strongly Thatcherite minister, Nicholas Ridley, a junior minister at the Foreign Office, proposed that in the House of Commons in December 1980 as government policy. But he met a huge wave of backbench opposition, not just from Conservatives, but also from Labour Party MPs. Peter Shaw really almost evoked John of Gaunt in saying that how can you betray the sceptred isle, this silver sea and so on, and how can you set out the British people? And the government had to back down. On the lease back, but the backbench hostility was too great. But I think the backbenchers never asked themselves what the alternative was, and whether it might not cause a war if no solution was reached. But after the leaseback proposal was defeated, the government really had no policy except to keep talking to the Argentinians and hope the matter would go away. Now, ironically, Lord Carrington, the Foreign Secretary, sent a number of notes to Margaret Thatcher warning her that this wouldn't work, that the Argentinians would see through all this, but Margaret Thatcher did not take any notice of it, and Lord Carrington turned out to be the victim. He resigned after the invasion. But at any rate, as we know, the invasion did not succeed, and the great British success, which as it were exorcised Suez, partly because the Americans were on our side, which they hadn't been at Suez. And Ronald Reagan wrote to Margaret Thatcher after the invasion, "We have a policy of neutrality on the sovereignty issue, but we cannot be neutral on the issue involving Argentine use of military force." Now, the war, victory in the war, had fundamental effects, I think. It first, and for the first time, confirmed in the general public mind that Margaret Thatcher was a leader of determination, obstinacy if you like, stick to her guns, a great patriot and so on. And therefore it prevented Conservative defections to the new party, the Social Democrat, the SDP under Roy Jenkins. Been danger of a Tory split, Tory revolt, perhaps wet Conservative defecting, but they didn't. But more importantly, the generation that had administered the post-war settlement was now going out of politics, and a new generation was clearly taking over. The generation that had administered the post-war settlement, Roy Jenkins, Shirley Williams, Dennis Healey, Michael Foot, Lord Carrington, Francis Pym, the leaders of the past were now leaders of the past. You had a new political generation with different moods. And the left-wing historian Eric Hobsbawm said of the war, he said this, he said, "The war had mobilised a public sentiment which could actually be felt. Because anyone of the left who was not aware of this grassroots feeling ought seriously to reconsider his or her capacity to assess politics." Now, before the Falklands War in 1981, Margaret Thatcher had the lowest rating of any Prime Minister since the war because of high unemployment. After that, she was the warrior queen, and people said Britain had found herself. And she said the same spirit could defeat Arthur Scargill and the miners. And she said in 1984, she told the Conservative Backbench Committee in 1922 that the Falklands were the enemy without, but the miners were the enemy within. More difficult to fight, but just as dangerous to liberty. In her memoirs, she calls Arthur Scargill and his colleagues the fascist left. And the defeat of the miners' strike confirmed the end of the trade union veto. Now, she fought on very good ground because the miners were not supported by the other trade unions who did not care much for Arthur Scargill. And indeed, one trade union leader said to a civil servant at the time that if the government did not destroy Scargill, he would never forgive us. And the leader of the electricians said at the Labour Party conference of 1984 that the miners were lions led by donkeys. So the other miners did not support them. But also, the strike showed that the working class solidarity that had sustained the Labour Party was much weaker than it had been. Very different, say, from the general strike in 1920 when everyone went out. Strikes even in the early 70s, much greater solidarity was gradually weakening. Solidarity that sustained Labour, but not only Labour, but the older One Nation Conservatives had rather admired that solidarity. Harold Macmillan said in 1984, he made a speech in the House of Lords, he said, "It breaks my heart to see what is happening to our country. this terrible strike with the best men in the world, who beat the Kaiser and who beat Hitler too, who never gave in, pointless, endless, we cannot afford that. Now contrast that with what Margaret Thatcher said in her memoirs. Said by the 1970s, the coal mining industry had come to symbolise everything that was wrong with Britain. And the strike led to the collapse of the National Union of Mine Workers. Their membership, which had been 253,000 in 1979, was only 53,000 in 1990, and now there are hardly any mines open at all, no miners. In 1978, before Margaret Thatcher came to office, 78% felt the unions were too strong. In 1990, just 17% thought that. It's a massive change in popular opinion. And it combined with a fall in the membership of the labour force in the older industries. And I say this wasn't entirely due to Margaret Thatcher, again partly a symptom, because you have a decline in the proportion working in manufacturing industry. And from that point of view, as so often in the history of the unions and the Labour Party, the miners, far from being a radicalising force, were a conservative force with a small c, keeping the mines open, keeping the traditions of the miners, what Harold Macmillan rather admired, looking back at the past, if you like. But all that was definitely of the past. Now, all this made for the third phase of Thatcherism, which you can call Thatcherism triumphant, from roughly 1983 to 1987. And that's marked by the economic programme of Thatcherism, privatisation, the sale of council houses, and deregulation of the city. Now, before the Big Bang of the city in 1984, the deregulation, the city was rather stuffy, run by many old families, and not perhaps very bright people. Lord Carrington said that his Eton master told him that stockbroking, together with farming and the army, was suitable for a really stupid boy. And there were a number of restrictive practices. He was going to have an old boy network. That women were not admitted to the stock exchange until 1973. Edward Heath, interestingly enough, when he was looking for a Conservative seat, he had two jobs in the late 1940s. One was news editor of the Church Times, and the second was a merchant banker. The first was then paid more than the second. The average income of the directors of Morgan Grenfell in 1979 was £40,000 a year. By 1986, it was £225,000 a year. So things changing very heavily through the deregulation of the city. Privatisation was not much referred to in the first Conservative manifesto of 1979, but the 1983 manifesto said our goal is a capital-owning democracy. Now that was only possible when people didn't fear the return of labour, because people weren't going to take shares in private industries if they thought they could be renationalised if the Labour Party won. But the landslide victory in 1983 meant there was no fear of Labour coming back, so you could denationalise. And some industries were underpriced when they were sold to the public. Nigel Lawson said that wasn't a wholly bad thing, because it meant large profits for the shareholders, and therefore convinced many people that privatisation was a good thing and that they should buy shares. And by 1990, most of the public utilities nationalised by the Acne government had been denationalised. The main major utilities remaining state-owned were the railways and the mines, and the railways were later themselves privatised. Now, privatisation was not aimed merely at increasing economic efficiency. If that had been the only aim, the thing to do would be to sell the state assets to existing companies and private operators. But the idea was to spread share ownership. Now, when the industries were nationalised in the 1940s, this was equated with public ownership. And when the mines were nationalised, there was a poster put up, these mines are now owned by the people. But the people didn't feel, I think, they owned the mines or the nationalised industries. And Margaret Thatcher said ownership of the state is not the same as ownership of the people. It is the very opposite. And what she wanted was what she called popular capitalism. By the end of the 1980s, there were more shareholders in Britain than there were trade unionists. There were 10 million shareholders and about 9 million trade unionists. And also, owner-occupiers now exceeded council tenants by around 2 to 1 in the working class, because combined with privatisation you had the policy of selling council houses to existing tenants, thereby creating a capital-owning country. And this was the idea, to diffuse ownership of property and capital. In the 1920s, the Conservatives had put forward the ideal of the property-owning democracy, and added to that now was an ideal of a capital-owning democracy. So you had a new Conservative electorate. The self-employed, the small shopkeepers, the skilled workers who wanted to better themselves could become middle class gradually by owning houses, by owning capital. And the argument was, if you want to get on in life, the Conservatives are on your side. And people who never expected to do so were now owning houses and shares. And the Labour Party opposed these policies, and this identified Labour until the time of Tony Blair as a bloc on popular aspirations. And people thought, if you want to try and get on in life, the Labour Party or the trade unions will block you. The Labour Council will not allow you to buy your council house. The Labour Council will not give you a choice of school. Your child will have to go to a neighbourhood comprehensive. It may not be any good. If you want to work longer hours to improve your position, the trade unions will block you. And the Labour government would tax you to limits on any extra income you earned. Now, the fourth phase of Thatcherism was a downfall, and it came out of the triumphs, because to encourage all this ownership, interest rates were lowered and remained low for too long. They were paid for by borrowing, and in late 1988 property prices started falling, and many people who owned houses found themselves in negative equity. Their houses were worth less than they'd paid for them, and they were suffering the consequences, if you like, of easy money. Perhaps we still face these consequences today. Easy borrowing was unsustainable, and that was one prime factor in the downfall of Thatcherism. A second was Europe, where Margaret Thatcher seemed to many Conservatives, oddly enough at that time, to be too hostile to Europe, and that led to the resignation of her Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, in 1990, and to Michael Heseltine's leadership challenge. And the third was the poll tax, which proved grossly unpopular. But she was probably not overthrown because of her policies, because most Conservatives, certainly in the country, was sceptical as she was about a federal Europe, but probably she'd been there too long. She was a victim of her success. There were no more dragons to slay. In a shadow cabinet discussion about trade union reform in the late 1970s, Lord Hailsham made the note, "Margaret wants to fight, but about what?" There was nothing left to fight. Time perhaps for a little relaxation, and John Major's slogan was, "A Britain at ease with itself," something quite different. And perhaps she'd created a new consensus, a new settlement, and was no longer needed, that it was for others to administer the settlement. Now, how should we conclude with the verdict on Thatcherism? The left said it was an accident, that Margaret Thatcher was lucky in her enemies, in Galtieri, the dictator of Argentina, Arthur Scargill, and the split in the left, of Michael Foot becoming leader of the Labour Party, and the struggles with Tony Benn, division in the left-wing vote when the SDP was formed. But all that is misleading, because without the split in the left, a lot of SDP voters would, I think, voted Conservative rather than the Labour Party of Foot and Benn and Kinnock and so on. But Thatcherism, as I've tried to show, was not just the product of one woman's brain. Indeed, one of her closest advisors, Sir Alfred Sherman, said, "In the 8 years that we worked closely together, I have never heard her express an original idea or even ask an insightful question." And certain conditions gave rise to Thatcherism, and probably any Conservative leader would have had to express it to some extent. Perhaps even a Labour leader. No Labour leader elected in 1979 could continue with incomes policies. Any Labour leader would have had to resist Arthur Scargill or fight in the Falklands. And a lot of the things done by Margaret Thatcher were done by governments of the left in other countries like Australia and New Zealand in particular, done by Labour governments. And to some extent her policies were inevitable in a period of globalization. They were dictated by the markets. But nevertheless their effects were considerable. One important consequence was the creation of New Labour. the abolition of Clause 4 in the Labour Party's constitution by Tony Blair in 1995, priority to controlling inflation, stressing the role of competition, a smaller state sector, lower taxation, less of a role for the trade unions. The Blair government, in fact, took a smaller share of national income in tax than Margaret Thatcher at any time, even including borrowing. Margaret Thatcher took 45.4% of national income in tax, Tony Blair 39.7%. 1997 was the first general election since the Labour Party was formed when nationalisation was not on the agenda. Indeed, the question for most people was not which industries will Labour nationalise, but which industries will Labour privatise. And Douglas Hurd said in 1997, the Conservatives lost the election having won the arguments. No one any longer thought Britain was ungovernable as they had in the 1970s. The only question was which party should govern. And no one on the left now thinks seriously of saying that inflation is not important, that a government can on its own achieve full employment, that government should adopt incomes policies, the state sector should be expanded, trade unions should have a larger role, taxation should be raised, Clause 4 restored, nationalisation the main aim of the Labour Party. No one says that. But even more than this, Labour recognised the importance of the role of the entrepreneur. You may remember Peter Mandelson saying he didn't mind people becoming filthy rich as long as they paid their taxes. Emphasis in the Labour Party on raising school standards. Welfare to work programmes, prudence, monetary continence. Gordon Brown's first term as Chancellor in 1997, he was nicknamed Prudence for very careful policies. So she made possible the economic success of New Labour. She broke through the constraints of the post-war Acne settlement. She broke the mould. The commitment to full employment, the commitment to the mixed economy, the commitment to trade unions being an estate of the realm. She helped create a new economic order. But she did not spectacularly increase the growth rate. The growth rate was actually lower not only in the 50s and 60s, but even in the despised 1970s. That was in part due to mass unemployment. Now, it's fair to say the growth rate everywhere in the 80s was lower than it had been in almost all countries, so perhaps you can't blame her for that. But we mustn't forget, we had the benefit of North Sea oil. We were self-sufficient in fuel supplies in the early 80s. And you may say this gave us a unique chance to outperform other countries, which we didn't achieve. So that, you may say, was a long-term failure. But you may say there was a long-term success in more flexible labour markets with the weakening of the trade unions, and that was important for the future, and perhaps that's one reason now why unemployment is not as high as it was in previous slumps, because the labour market is more flexible. And this shows that some of the consequences are long-term of Thatcherism. Now, she created a new economic order, also a new social order, in which the whole corporate structure was dismantled, in which politics seemed to be sticky and not fluid. And it's now become fluid. You've had changes in behaviour. We live in a much more individualistic age. David Cameron has called a post-bureaucratic age. And the essence of the society now is much greater fluidity, much greater scope for the individual, a new individualism, if you like. But there is also a downside to Thatcherism. And the main weakness was this, that traditionally Conservatives have been deeply concerned with the nature of society, community, solidarity that Harold Macmillan spoke of. But capitalism, as it were, certainly the capitalism unleashed by Margaret Thatcher, undermined that stability. Sir Keith Joseph ran a body called the Mulberry Trust to provide housing for deprived people. And he noticed, rather sadly, the divorce rate was higher amongst people who lived in the Mulberry Trust houses than amongst those on the waiting lists. In other words, the long-desired security of the home gave couples a chance to reappraise their relationships. So prosperity does not necessarily lead to a more stable society, can lead to a more volatile one. Now, are the entrepreneurs created by the city, by the yuppie culture that was created in the 80s, are they really the heroes of Thatcherite ideology, or did they themselves help to undermine the sense of social responsibility? Now, the Conservatives accepted that a moral framework was needed if markets were to work. And Keith Joseph himself said that in 1975. He said, "It is characteristic of the past 2 decades that almost exclusive obsession with economics by governments and competitive claims to usher in utopia have coincided with economic failure. A healthy economy is possible only in a healthy body politic, with self-reliance, thrift, respect for laws and confidence in a system of rewards and sanctions." But did the get-rich-quick ethic really encourage those virtues? Was not Thatcherism originally meant to be about living within one's means? The Grantham ethic, saving individual responsibility, rewards for skill and hard work. Margaret Thatcher said her father had seen buying shares as a form of gambling. The market liberalism appealed in a way to the 1960s. Free choice, the consumer's king, do your own thing, do what you want. But if the market order relies on thrift and prudence, they're not very easily compatible. And perhaps we're now seeing the consequences, the long drawn-out social consequences, in all the arguments about bankers' bonuses, sense of responsibility in society and so on. Perhaps that's another long-term consequence of Thatcherism. And this is a dilemma, that if you want successful capitalism, you have to engineer a certain sort of society in which these virtues of thrift and self-reliance and all the rest of it are prominent. How do you do it? It's a problem the Conservatives didn't resolve. It's fair to say it's a problem that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown also did not resolve. And perhaps Margaret Thatcher didn't therefore alter our values as much as she thought. And Michael Foot rather caricatured what they were after when he compared Keith Joseph to a conjurer at the fair. And he said he takes your watch, he wraps it in a handkerchief, and he smashes it with a hammer. And then he says, "Oh dear, I've forgotten the second half of the trick." But let me not end on a negative note. Keith Joseph was fond of quoting these lines from a now forgotten poet, Alfred O'Shaughnessy. He said, "One man with a dream, at pleasure, shall go forth and conquer a crown, and 3 with a new song's measure can trample a kingdom down." And you can argue that Margaret Thatcher trampled a kingdom down, the kingdom of statism inherited from the war years, and conquered a crown by helping to create a society based on the tenets of economic liberalism. She helped create a new consensus which the rise of New Labour validated, a new common ground based on the market economy. And so her heirs are not only John Major and David Cameron, but also Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Because New Labour sought, as Joseph had done and Margaret Thatcher had done, to marry economic efficiency with social compassion, though I say they didn't resolve the conundrum, and perhaps there's no solution and we just have to live with social dislocation. Now let me end on this note. It relates to something Tony Benn once said. He said when Margaret Thatcher was defeated, fell, he produced a bill in Parliament, an omnipurpose bill, which would have the effect of abrogating immediately every piece of legislation passed by Margaret Thatcher. But he said even if it had passed, which of course it wouldn't, he said it wouldn't have had much effect because Margaret Thatcher was a great teacher. And he said that was her influence, not on her specific legislation. And he then said the left hasn't had a great teacher since Aneurin Bevan hasn't had a similar teacher. So I think that was the effect of Margaret Thatcher, summed up by one of her great opponents who perhaps had more in common with her than either would be willing to admit. But I think what can't be disputed is that we inhabit a world largely created by Margaret Thatcher and will probably continue to do so for a long time to come. Thank you.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.